XXII. In which I meet with a Literary Tinker Even in that drowsy, semi conscious state, that most delightful borderland which lies midway between sleeping and waking, I knew it could not be the woodpecker who, as I judged from sundry manifest signs, lodged in the tree above me. No woodpecker that ever pecked could originate such sounds as these: two quick, light strokes followed by another, and heavier, thus: tap, 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 and pause, and then tap, tap, tap again, and so on. Whatever doubts I may have yet harbored on this subject, however, were presently dispelled by a fragrance sweeter, to the nostrils of a hungry man, than the breath of flowers, the spices of the East, or all the vaunted perfumes of Arabia; in a word, the odor of frying bacon. Hereupon I suddenly realized how exceedingly keen was my appetite, and sighed, bethinking me that I must first find a tavern before I could satisfy my craving, when a voice reached me from no great distance, a full, rich, sonorous voice singing a song. And the words of the song were these: "A tinker am I, oh, a tinker am I, a tinker I'll live, and a tinker I'll die. If the king in his crown could change places with me, I'd laugh so I would, and I'd say unto he, a tinker I am, oh, a tinker am I, a tinker I'll live, and a tinker I'll die." It was a quaint air, with a shake at the end of the first two and last two lines, which, altogether, I thought very pleasing. I advanced, guided by the voice, until I came out into a grassy lane. Seated upon an artfully contrived folding stool was a man. He was a very small man, despite his great voice, who held a kettle between his knees, and a light hammer in his hand, while a little to one side of him there blazed a crackling fire of twigs, upon which a hissing frying pan was balanced. But what chiefly drew and held my attention was the man's face, narrow and peaked, with little, round, twinkling eyes set deep in his head, close black hair, grizzled at the temples, and a long, blue chin. And presently, as I stood staring at him, he finished his song, and, chancing to raise his eyes, stared back at me. "Good morning," said he at last, with a bright nod. "So then you didn't cut your throat in the hollow oak, after all," said I. "Nor likely to either, master," he answered, shaking his head. "Lord love your eyes and limbs, no." "But," said I, "some day or so ago I met a man—" "Ah!" nodded the Tinker, "to be sure you did. A pedler of brooms and ribbons—" "Gabbing Dick," nodded the Tinker, "who told me very seriously—" "That I'd been found in the big holler oak with my throat cut," nodded the Tinker. "But what did he mean by it?" "Why, ye see," explained the Tinker, leaning over to turn a frizzling bacon rasher very dexterously with the blade of a jackknife, "ye see, Gabbing Dick is uncommon fond of murders, hangings, suicides, and such like. It's just a way he's got." "A very unpleasant way," said I. "But very harmless when all's done and said," added the Tinker. "You mean?" "A little weak up here," explained the Tinker, tapping his forehead with the handle of the jackknife. "His father was murdered the day before he were born, d'ye see, which druv his poor mother out of her mind, which conditions is apt to make a man a leetle strange." "Poor fellow!" said I, while the Tinker began his tap-tapping again. "Are you hungry?" he inquired suddenly, glancing up at me with his hammer poised. "Very hungry," said I. Hereupon he set down his hammer, and, turning to a pack at his side, proceeded to extract therefrom a loaf of bread, a small tin of butter, and a piece of bacon, from which last he cut sundry slices with the jackknife. He now lifted the hissing rashers from the pan to a tin plate, which he set upon the grass at my feet, together with the bread and the butter, and, having produced a somewhat battered knife and fork, handed them to me with another bright nod. "You are very kind," said I. "Why, the man is as fond o' company, ye see. especially of one who can think, and talk, and you have the face of both. I am, as you might say, a literary cove, being fond of books, novels, and such like." And in a little while, the bacon being done to his liking, we sat down together and began to eat. "That was a strange song of yours," said I, after a while. "Did you like it?" he inquired, with a quick tilt of his head. "Both words and tune," I answered. "I made the words myself," said the Tinker. "And do you mean it?" "Mean what?" asked the Tinker. "That you would rather be a tinker than a king." "Why, to be sure I would," he rejoined. "Being a literary cove, I know summat o' history, and a king's life weren't all lavender, not by no manner o' means, nor yet a bed o' roses." "Yet there's much to be said for a king." "Very little, I think," said the Tinker. "A king has great advantages." "Which he generally abuses," said the Tinker. "There have been some great and noble kings." "But a great many more bad 'uns," said the Tinker. "And then, look how often they got theirselves pisoned, or stabbed, or 'ad their 'eads chopped off. No, if you axes me, I prefer to tinker a kettle under a hedge." "Then you are contented?" "Not quite," he answered, his face falling. "Me being a literary cove, as I think I've mentioned afore, it 'as always been my wish to be a scholar." "Far better a tinker," said I. "Young fellow," said the Tinker, shaking his head reprovingly, "you're off the mark there. Knowledge is power. Why, Lord love my eyes and limbs, what's finer than to be able to read in the Greek and Latin?" "To possess the capacity of earning an honest livelihood," said I. "Why, I tell you," continued the Tinker, unheeding my remark, "I'd give this here left hand o' mine to be able to read the very words of such men as Plato, Aristotle, Epictetus, Xenophon, and all the rest of 'em." "There are numerous translations," said I. "Ah, to be sure," sighed the Tinker, "but then they are translations." "There are good translations as well as bad," said I. "Maybe," returned the Tinker, "maybe, but a translation's only a echo, after all, however good it be." As he spoke, he dived into his pack and brought forth a book, which he handed to me. It was a smallish volume in battered leathern covers, and had evidently seen much long and hard service. Opening it at the title page, I read: "Epictetus, his Enchiridion, with Simplicius, his comment. Made English from the Greek by George Stanhope, late Fellow of King's College in Cambridge, London. Printed for Richard Sayre at Gray's Inn Gate, in Holborn, and Joseph Hindmarsh against the Exchange in Cornhill, 1694. "You've read Epictetus, perhaps?" inquired the Tinker. "I have." "Not in the Greek, of course?" "Yes," said I, smiling, "though by dint of much labor." The Tinker stopped chewing to stare at me wide eyed, then swallowed his mouthful at one gulp. "Lord love me!" he exclaimed, "and you so young too!" "No," said I, "I'm 25." "And Latin, now, don't tell me you can read the Latin?" "But I can't make a kettle, or even mend one for that matter," said I. "But you're a scholar, and it's a fine thing to be a scholar." "And I tell you again, it is better to be a tinker," said I. "How so?" "It is a healthier life, in the first place," said I. "That I can believe," nodded the Tinker. "It is a happier life, in the second place." "That I doubt," returned the Tinker. "And, in the third place, it pays much better." "That I don't believe," said the Tinker. "Nevertheless," said I, "speaking for myself, I have, in the course of my 25 years, earned but 10 shillings, and that but by the sale of my waistcoat." "Lord love me!" exclaimed the Tinker, staring. "A man," I pursued, "may be a far better scholar than I, may be full of the wisdom of the ancients, and the teachings of all the great thinkers and philosophers, and yet starve to death; indeed, frequently does. But who ever heard of a starving tinker?" "But a scholar may write great books," said the Tinker. "A scholar rarely writes a great book," said I, shaking my head. probably for the good and sufficient reason that great books never are written." "Young fellow," said the Tinker, staring, "what do you mean by that?" "I mean that truly great books only happen, and very rarely." "But a scholar may happen to write a great book," said the Tinker. "To be sure, he may; a book that nobody will risk publishing, and, if so, a book that nobody will trouble to read nowadays." "Why so?" "Because this is an eminently unliterary age, incapable of thought, and therefore seeking to be amused. Whereas the writing of books was once a painful art, it has of late become a trick very easy of accomplishment, requiring no regard for probability, and little thought, so long as it is packed sufficiently full of impossible incidents through which a ridiculous heroine, and a more absurd hero, duly sigh their appointed way to the last chapter. Whereas books were once a power, they are of late degenerated into things of amusement with which to kill an idle hour, and be promptly forgotten the next." "Yet the great books remain," said the Tinker. "Yes," said I, "but who troubles their head over Homer or Virgil these days? Who cares to open Steele's Tatler, or Addison's Spectator, while there is the latest novel to be had, or Bell's Life to be found on any coffee house table?" "And why," said the Tinker, looking at me over a piece of bacon skewered upon the point of his jackknife, "why don't you write a book?" "I probably shall some day," I answered. "And supposing," said the Tinker, eyeing the piece of bacon thoughtfully, "supposing nobody ever reads it?" "The worse for them," said I. Thus we talked of books, and the making of books, something of which I have already set down in another place, until our meal was at an end. "You are a rather strange young man, I think," said the Tinker, as, having duly wiped knife, and fork, and plate upon a handful of grass, I handed them back. "Yet you are a stranger tinker." "How so?" "Why, who ever heard of a tinker who wrote verses, and worked with a copy of Epictetus at his elbow?" "Which I don't deny as I'm a great thinker," nodded the Tinker. "To be sure, I think a powerful lot." "A dangerous habit," said I, shaking my head, "and a most unwise one." "Eh?" cried the Tinker, staring. "Your serious thinking man," I explained, "is seldom happy; as a rule has few friends, being generally regarded askance, and is always misunderstood by his fellows. All the world's great thinkers, from Christ down, were generally misunderstood, looked at askance, and had very few friends." "But these are all great men," said the Tinker. "We think so now, but in their day they were very much despised. And who was more hated, by the very people he sought to aid, than Christ?" "By the evil doers, yes," nodded the Tinker. "On the contrary," said I, "his worst enemies were men of learning, good citizens and patterns of morality, who looked upon him as a dangerous zealot, threatening the destruction of the old order of things, hence they killed him, as an agitator. Things are much the same to day. History tells us that Christ, or the spirit of Christ, has entered into many men who have striven to enlighten and better the conditions of their kind, and they have generally met with violent deaths, for humanity is very gross and blind." The Tinker slowly wiped his clasp knife upon the leg of his breeches, closed it, and slipped it into his pocket. "Nevertheless," said he at last, "I am convinced that you are a very strange young man." "Be that as it may," said I, "the bacon was delicious. I have never enjoyed a meal so much, except once in an inn called the Old Cock." "I know it," nodded the Tinker, "a very poor house." "But the ham and eggs are beyond praise," said I. "Still, my meal here under the trees with you will long remain a pleasant memory." "Good by, then," said the Tinker. "Good by, young man, and I wish you happiness." "What is happiness?" said I. The Tinker removed his hat, and having scratched his head, put it on again. "Happiness," said he, "happiness is the state of being content with oneself, the world, and everything in general." "Then," said I, "I fear I can never be happy." "And why not?" "Because, supposing I ever became contented with the world, and everything in general, which is highly improbable, I shall never, never be contented with myself." Book Chapter 23 Concerning Happiness, a Ploughman, and Silver Buttons. Now, as I went pondering on true happiness, and the nature of it, I beheld a man ploughing in a field hard by, and as he ploughed, he whistled lustily. And drawing near to the field, I sat down upon a gate and watched, for there are few sights and sounds I am fonder of than the gleam of the ploughshare and the sighing whisper it makes as it turns the fragrant loam. "A truly noble occupation," said I to myself, "dignified by the ages, ay, old, well nigh, as the green earth itself. No man need be ashamed to guide a plough." And indeed a fine sight it made, the straining horses, the stalwart figure of the ploughman, with the blue sky, the long brown furrows, and, away and beyond, the tender green of leaves, while the jingle of the harness, the clear, merry, whistled notes, and the song of a skylark, high above our heads, all blended into a chorus it was good to hear. As he came up to where I sat upon the gate, the ploughman stopped, and, wiping the glistening moisture from his brow, nodded good-humoredly. "A fine morning," said I. "So be it, sir, now you come to mention it, it do be a fine day, surely." "You at least seem happy," said I. "Happy!" he exclaimed, staring. "Yes," said I. "Well, I bean't." "And why not?" The ploughman scratched his ear, and carried his glance from my face up to the sky, and down again. "I dunno," he answered, "but I bean't." "Yet you whistle gayly enough." "Why, a man must do summat." "Then you seem strong and healthy." "Yes, I do be fine and hearty." "And sleep well?" "Like a blessed log." "And eat well?" "Eat!" he exclaimed with a mighty laugh. "Lord! I should think so. Why, I'm always eatin' or thinkin' of it. Oh, I'm a fine eater, I am. And I bean't no chicken at drinkin' neither." "Then you ought to be happy." "Ah, but I bean't," he repeated, shaking his head. "Have you any troubles?" "None as I can think on." "You earn good money every week?" "10 shillin'." "You are not married?" "Not me." "Then," said I, "you must be happy." The ploughman pulled at his ear again, looking slowly all round the field, and finally shook his head. "Well," said he, "I bean't." "But why not?" His eye roved slowly up from my boots to the buttons of my coat. "Them be fine buttons," said he. "Do you think so?" "Look like silver." "They are silver," said I.
"Lord!"
he exclaimed,
"you wouldn't part with they buttons, I suppose?"
"That depends."
"On what?"
"On how much you would give for them." The ploughman thrust a hand into a deep pocket, and brought up 5 shillings.
"I were a goin' to buy a pair o' boots on my way home," he explained, "but I'd rayther have they buttons, if 5 shillin' 'll buy 'em."
"The boots would be more serviceable," said I.
"Maybe, sir, but then everybody wears boots, but there bean't many as can show buttons the like o' them, so if you're willin' "
"Lend me your knife," said I, and forthwith I sawed off the 8 silver buttons and dropped them into his palm, whereupon he handed me the money with great alacrity. "And now," said I, "tell me why you are not happy."
"Well," returned the ploughman, back at his ear again, "ye see, it bein' as you ask so sudden like, I can't 'zactly say, but if you was to pass by in a day or two, why, maybe I could tell ye."
So, pocketing the buttons, he whooped cheerily to his horses, and plodded off, whistling more merrily than ever. Book Chapter 24 Which introduces the reader to the Ancient. The sun was high when I came to a place where the ways divided, and, while I stood hesitating which road to take, I heard the cool splash and murmur of a brook at no great distance. Wherefore, being hot and thirsty, I scrambled through the hedge, and, coming to the brook, threw myself face down beside it, and, catching up the sweet pure water in my hands, drank my fill. Which done, I bathed my feet, and hands, and face, and became much heartened and refreshed thereby. Now, because I have ever loved the noise of running waters, in a little while I rose and walked on beside the stream, listening to its blithesome melody. So, by devious ways, for the brook wound prodigiously, I came at length to a sudden declivity down which the water plunged in a miniature cascade, sparkling in the sun, and gleaming with 1,000 rainbow hues. On I went, climbing down as best I might, until I found myself in a sort of green basin, very cool after the heat and glare of the roads, for the high, tree-clad sides afforded much shade. On I went, past fragrant thickets and bending willows, with soft lush grass underfoot, and leafy arches overhead, and the brook singing and chattering at my side, albeit a brook of changeful mood, now laughing and dimpling in some fugitive ray of sunshine, now sighing and whispering in the shadows, but ever moving upon its appointed way, and never quite silent. So I walked on beside the brook, watching the fish that showed like darting shadows on the bottom, until, chancing to raise my eyes, I stopped, and there, screened by leaves, shut in among the green, stood a small cottage or hut. My second glance showed it to be tenantless, for the thatch was partly gone, the windows were broken, and the door had long since fallen from its hinges. Yet, despite its forlornness and desolation, despite the dilapidation of broken door and fallen chimney, there was something in the air of the place that drew me strangely. It was somewhat roughly put together, but still very strong, and seemed, save for the roof, weather-fast. A man might do worse than live here, thought I, with the birds for neighbors, and the brook to sing him to sleep at night. Indeed, a man might live very happily in such a place. I was still looking at the hut, with this in my mind, when I was startled by hearing a thin, quavering voice behind me. "Be you looking at the cottage, master?" Turning sharp round, I beheld a very ancient man in a smock frock, who carried a basket on one arm, and leaned upon a stick. "Yes," I answered. I was wondering how it came to be built in such an out-of-the-world spot. "Why, 'twere built by a wanderin' man o' the roads." "It's very lonely," said I.
"You may well say so, sir. Haunted it be, too." "Haunted?" said I. "Haunted as ever was,"
answered the old man, with a sprightly nod strangely contrasting with his wrinkled face and tremulous limbs.
"No one ventures nigh the place after dark, and few enough i' the daytime, for that matter."
"On account of the ghost?"
"Ah!"
nodded the Ancient.
"Moans he do, and likewise groans. There's some as says he twitters too, and shakes chains."
"Then nobody has lived here of late?"
"Bless 'ee, no, nor wouldn't know, not if you paid him to. Nobody's come a nigh the place, you may say, since 'twere built by the wanderin' man. Lived 'ere all alone, 'e did. Killed 'isself 'ere likewise."
"Killed himself?" said I.
"Ah! 'ung himself behind the door yonder, 66 year ago come August, and 'twere me as found him, ye see,"
said the old man, setting down his basket, and seating himself with great nicety on the moss-grown doorstep.
"Ye see, 'twere a tur'ble storm that night, rain and wind, with every now and then a gert, cracklin' flame o' lightnin'. I mind I'd been up to the farm a courtin' o' Nancy Brent, she'm dead now, poor lass, years and years ago, but she were a fine buxom maid in those days, d'ye see. Well, I were comin' home, and what wi' one thing and another, I lost my way, and presently, as I were stumblin' along in the dark, comes another crackle o' lightnin', and lookin' up, what should I see but this 'ere cottage. 'Twere newer lookin' then, wi' a door and winders, but the door was shut, and the winders was dark, so there I stood in the rain, not likin' to disturb the stranger, for 'e were a gert, fierce, unfriendly kind o' chap, and uncommon fond o' bein' left alone. Howsoever, arter a while, up I goes to the door, and knocks, for I were a good, strong, strappin', well-lookin' figure o' a man myself, in those days, d'ye see, and could give a good buffet, and take one too. And so up I goes to the door, and knocks wi' my fist clenched, all ready, and a tidy, sizable fist it were in those days. But Lord, nobody answered, so at last I lifted the latch."
Here the Ancient paused to draw a snuff box from his pocket, with great deliberation, noting my awakened interest with a twinkling eye. "Well?" I inquired.
"Well," he continued slowly, "I lifted the latch, and give a push to the door, but it would only open a little way, an inch p'raps, and stuck."
There he tapped, and opened his snuff box. "Well?" I inquired again.
"Well," he went on, "I give it a gert big push wi' my shoulder, I were a fine strong chap in those days, and just as it flew open, comes another flash o' lightnin', and the fust thing I seen was a boot."
"A boot?"
I exclaimed. "A boot as ever was," nodded the Ancient,
and took a pinch of snuff with great apparent gusto. "Go on," said I, "go on."
"Oh, it's a fine story, a fine story," he chuckled. "There bean't many men o' my age as has fund a hung man in a thunderstorm. Well, as I tell ye, I seen a boot, likewise a leg, and theer were this 'ere wanderin' man o' the roads a danglin' be'ind the door from a stapil. Look ye!"
he exclaimed, rising with some little difficulty, and hobbling into the hut.
"There be the very stapil, so it be."
And he pointed up to a rusty iron staple that had been driven deep into the beam above the door. "And why," said I, "why did he hang himself?"
"Seein' he 'ad no friends, and never told nobody, nobody ever knowed," answered the old man, shaking his head. "But on that theer staple he 'ung hisself, and on that theer staple I fund him, on a stormy night 66 year ago come August."
"You have a wonderful memory," said I.
"Ay, to be sure, a wonnerful memory, a wonnerful memory."
66 years is an age," said I.
So be it," nodded the Ancient. "I were a fine young chap in those days, tall I were, and straight as an arrer. I be a bit different now."
"Why, you are getting old," said I.
"So's the staple yonder, but t' staple looks nigh as good as ever."
"Iron generally wears better than flesh and blood," said I. "It's only natural."
"Ay, but it can't last for ever," said the Ancient, frowning and shaking his head at the rusty staple. "I've watched un, month in and month out, all these years, and seen un growin' rustier and rustier. 'I'll last 'ee out yet,' I've said to 'im. 'E knows it, 'e've heard me, many and many a time. 'I'll last 'ee out yet,' I've said, and so I will, too. 'E can't last for ever, and I be a vigorous man, a mortal vigorous man, bean't I?"
"Wonderfully," said I.
"And so strong as a bull?"
"To be sure."
"And t' staple can't last much longer, eh, maester, so old and rusty as 'e be?"
"One would hardly think so."
"Not so long as a tur'ble vigorous man like I be?" he inquired, with a certain wistful appeal in his eyes. "No," I answered impulsively. "I knowed it, I knowed it!" he chuckled, feebly brandishing his stick. "Such a poor old staple as 'tis, all eat up wi' rust. Every time I come 'ere a gatherin' watercress, I come and give un a look, and watch 'em rustin' away, and rustin' away. I'll see un go first, arter all, so I will."
And, with another nod at the staple, he turned, and hobbled out into the sunshine. And, seeing how, despite his brave showing, he labored to carry the heavy bucket, I presently took it from him, disregarding his protests, and set off by his side. Yet, as he went, I turned once to look back at the deserted hut.
"You'm thinkin' 'tis a tur'ble bad place at night?" said the old man.
"On the contrary," I answered, "I was thinking it might suit a homeless man like me very well indeed."
"D'ye mean to live there?" exclaimed the Ancient.
"Yes."
said I. "Then you bean't afraid o' the ghost?" "No," I answered. "P'r'aps you be one o' they fools as think theer bean't no ghosts." "As to that," I answered, "I don't know, but I don't think I should be much afraid, and it is a great blessing to have some spot on this unfriendly world that we can call home, even though it be but a hut, and haunted." In a little while the path he followed led up a somewhat steep ascent which, though not so precipitous as the place where I had entered the hollow, was a difficult climb notwithstanding. Seeing which, I put out a hand to aid my aged companion, but he repulsed me almost sharply. "Let be," he panted, "let be. Nobody's ever helped me up this 'ere path, and nobody never shall." So up we went, the Ancient and I, side by side and very slowly, until, the summit being reached, he seated himself, spent and breathless, upon a fallen tree, which had doubtless served this purpose many times before, and mopped at his wrinkled brow with a trembling hand. "Ye see," he cried, as soon as he had recovered his breath sufficiently, "ye see, I be won'erful spry and active, could dance ye a hornpipe any day, if I was so minded." "On my word," said I, "I believe you could. But where are you going now?" "To Sissin'urst." "How far is that?" "'Bout a mile 'cross t' fields. You can see the pint o' Joel Amos's oast house above the trees yonder."
"Is there a good inn at Sissinghurst?"
"Ay, theer's 'The Bull,' comfortable, and draws fine ale."
"Then I will go to Sissinghurst."
"Ay, ay," nodded the old man, "if it be good ale and a comfortable inn you want, you need seek no further nor Sissinghurst. 91 years I've lived there, and I know."
"91 years!" I repeated.
"As ever was," returned the Ancient, with another nod. "I be the oldest man in these parts, 'cept David Ralph, and 'e died last year."
"Why then, if he's dead, you must be the oldest," said I.
"No," said the Ancient, shaking his head, "ye see it be this way. David were my brother, and uncommon proud 'e were o' being the oldest man in these parts. And now that 'e be dead and gone, it do seem a poor thing, ah! a very poor thing, to tak' advantage of a dead man, and 'im my own brother."
Saying which, the Ancient rose, and we went on together, side by side, towards Sissinghurst village. Section 9